I need to get this out because the banging on my door has been going on for 3 hours now, and I'm about to lose my mind. My dad, mom, sister Anita, Uncle Larry, and Aunt Cynthia are all outside my apartment building right now, and from what I can see on my security camera, they look like they haven't slept in days. They keep pressing my buzzer, calling my phone, which I've had on silent, and I can hear my dad actually crying through the door. Yeah, the same man who called me a loser at my mother's birthday party is crying in my hallway. But let me back up because this is a long time coming, and you need the full picture to understand why I'm sitting here, eating leftover pizza while they lose their minds outside. 3 years ago, I was 29, and honestly in a rough spot. I'd been laid off from my job at a warehouse about 8 months before that, and I was scrambling to find work while living in a cramped studio apartment that smelled like old carpet and desperation. I was applying to everything, taking odd jobs, doing whatever I could to keep my head above water. My family knew this. They knew I was struggling, and they used every single opportunity to remind me that I was the family disappointment. My sister Anita had just gotten promoted to some management position at her company. My brother Dominic was doing well in sales. My other brother Ellis worked in IT and made decent money. And then there was me, the youngest, the one who couldn't seem to get it together. My parents never missed a chance to compare me to my siblings. Every family dinner, every phone call, every interaction was just another opportunity for them to point out how much better everyone else was doing. But the worst part wasn't even the comparisons. It was that they seemed to enjoy it, like watching me struggle gave them some kind of sick satisfaction. My mom would call me just to tell me about Anita's latest achievement, and then ask me how the job search was going with this tone that made it clear she already knew the answer and was asking just to watch me squirm. My dad would make jokes about how I should just live in their basement forever since I couldn't afford my own place anyway. So when my mom's 60th birthday rolled around 2.5 years ago, I knew it was going to be brutal, but I went anyway because that's what you do, right? You show up for family even when they treat you like garbage. I spent 3 days making her a birthday card because I couldn't afford to buy jewelry like my siblings. I actually put effort into it, used nice paper I bought from an art supply store, wrote out a heartfelt message about how much she meant to me, included old family photos I'd scanned and printed. It cost me about $40 total, which was a lot for me at the time, but I wanted to show her I cared even if I couldn't drop hundreds on a gift. The party was at my parents' house, and the whole extended family was there. Uncle Larry, Aunt Cynthia, cousins, family friends, probably about 30 people total. The dining room table was set up nice, wine bottles everywhere, fancy food I definitely couldn't afford. Everyone was dressed up and I showed up in my best clothes, which were honestly pretty worn out by that point. I could see my sister looking at my shirt when I walked in and I knew she was judging. Dinner was going fine at first. People were talking, laughing, telling stories. My mom was happy opening gifts from the guests. Then came time for the family to give their gifts. Dominic went first with this expensive necklace. Ellis got her some designer handbag, and Anita bought her a weekend spa package. Everyone was clapping and my mom was gushing over each gift, hugging them, telling them how thoughtful they were. Then it was my turn. I handed her the card, and I could see her face change immediately. She opened it, looked at it for maybe 5 seconds, and then set it aside on the table without saying anything. Just put it down like it was junk mail. The whole table got quiet. That's when my dad stood up with his wine glass. I thought he was going to make a toast about my mom, something nice to celebrate her birthday. Instead, he raised his glass and said to my wife, who birthed 3 perfect children and 1 loser, just said it right there in front of everyone. People laughed. Some of them tried to hide it, but they laughed. I sat there frozen, and before I could even process what had just happened, Aunt Cynthia jumped in. She asked if I was still unemployed, said her dog had more career prospects than me. More laughter. Uncle Larry joined in, suggested maybe I could wash dishes for leftovers. My sister Anita grabbed the card I'd made and held it up, asked what trash this was, said it looked like I'd made it from dumpster paper. My mom picked it back up, looked at it again, and told me it was pathetic, that my siblings bought her real gifts and I brought her embarrassment. Then people started throwing wadded-up napkins at me, actually throwing them at me like I was some kind of target, and I just sat there. I didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't storm out. I smiled. I kept smiling through the whole thing because I decided right then that I was done. Completely done. I smiled, and I stayed through dessert, and I helped clean up. And the whole time I was planning exactly how I was going to cut every single one of them out of my life. Here's what they didn't know. 3 weeks before that birthday party, I'd gotten a job offer. A good one. Really good, actually. It was with a mid-sized company doing logistics coordination, and they were offering me $65,000 a year plus benefits. I hadn't told my family yet because I wanted to wait until I actually started and made sure it was real. I was supposed to start the following month. That card I made my mom, I was going to tell her about the job at the party. I was going to share my good news, show them I was finally turning things around. But after what happened at that dinner table, I decided they didn't deserve to know. I started the job 4 weeks after the birthday party, and I didn't tell anyone in my family. I let them keep thinking I was unemployed and struggling. When my mom called to ask how I was doing, I kept my answers vague. When my dad made jokes about me being a deadbeat, I just said, yeah, sure, whatever. I stopped going to family events, made excuses, said I was busy with job applications. They bought it because they wanted to believe I was still failing. And while they thought I was drowning, I was building. I was good at my job, really good. Within 6 months, I got a raise. Within a year, I was training new people. I moved out of that studio apartment into a decent one-bedroom. I started saving money, investing, making smart financial decisions. I kept every interaction with my family surface level and brief. They had no idea. But here's where it gets interesting and coy, and this is the part they're really panicking about now. See, 5 years before all this happened, when I was 24 and my dad was starting a small delivery business, he needed someone to co-sign on the business loan because his credit wasn't great. He'd had some issues with debt in his 20s that still affected his score. My grandpa had just died and left me $15,000, and my dad convinced me to put that money down as collateral and co-sign the loan. He promised he'd pay me back, promised the business would be successful, told me it was a family investment and we'd all benefit. I was young and stupid, and I wanted to help my dad, so I did it. Signed the papers, put my money down, became legally attached to his business. And you know what? The business did okay. Not great, but okay. My dad paid the monthly loan payments, and I kind of forgot about the whole thing because it wasn't causing me any problems. Until I didn't forget about it anymore. After that birthday party, I started looking into that loan. Really looking into it. I pulled all the paperwork, reviewed the terms, talked to a lawyer, and I learned some very interesting things. First, as a co-signer, I had certain rights regarding the business. Second, there was a clause in the loan agreement about what happens if certain conditions aren't met. Third, my dad had been late on payments multiple times over the years, which technically put the loan in a risky position. I spent 2 years quietly preparing. I documented every late payment, every issue. I built my credit score back up, got my finances completely in order. I made sure I understood every single legal option I had. And I waited. I knew eventually they'd need something from me, or they'd realize I wasn't the failure they thought I was. And when that happened, I wanted to be ready. That brings us to 3 days ago. I guess my cousin Nathan, who I barely talk to anymore, ran into my old coworker from the warehouse job at a gym. They got talking, and my old coworker mentioned that I'd done really well for myself after leaving, that he'd heard I was making good money now and had moved up in my company. Nathan apparently went straight to my parents with this information. My mom called me that afternoon. I almost didn't answer, but I was curious what she wanted. She asked if it was true that I had a good job now, and I said, yeah, I've been working for almost 3 years. There was this long silence, and then she asked why I never told them. I said because you never asked, which was true. They'd been so convinced I was a loser that they never actually followed up or showed genuine interest in my life. She tried to laugh it off, said they were just joking at the birthday party, that it was all in good fun, and surely I knew they didn't mean it. I told her I had to go and hung up. She called back immediately, but I didn't answer. Then yesterday, my dad called, left a voicemail saying we needed to talk about the business loan, said there'd been some complications and he needed to discuss the situation with me as soon as possible. I didn't call back. Last night, my sister Anita sent me a long text message. She said the whole family wanted to apologize for how they'd treated me, that they realized they'd been too harsh and they wanted to make things right. She asked if we could meet for dinner to talk things through. I read it and deleted it. And then this morning, they all showed up here. I woke up to banging on my apartment door and my dad yelling my name. I looked through the peephole and saw all of them standing there looking panicked. My mom was crying. My dad was red in the face. Anita looked like she hadn't slept. And my aunt and uncle were there too, like this was some kind of intervention. I opened my security camera app on my phone and watched them from my bedroom. My dad kept saying, please, we need to talk to you. Please, just open the door. My mom was saying she was sorry over and over. Aunt Cynthia was saying, we made a mistake. We're so sorry. They looked genuinely terrified. And honestly, it was the best thing I'd seen in years. I haven't opened the door, and I'm not going to. They can stand out there all day for all I care. Because here's what I know that they've just figured out. My dad's business has been struggling for the past year, and he needs me to either refinance that loan with him or release my interest in the business so he can restructure his debt. Without my cooperation, he's in serious financial trouble. And after spending years treating me like garbage, after humiliating me at my mother's birthday party in front of the entire family, After making me feel worthless and pathetic for struggling during the hardest period of my life, they actually think I'm going to help them. The banging stopped about 20 minutes ago, and I checked the camera. They're sitting in the hallway now. My mom and Anita are on the floor with their backs against the wall. My dad is pacing, and my aunt and uncle are talking in low voices. They look defeated and desperate, and I am here for every second of it. I've been waiting 2.5 years for this moment. I didn't know exactly how it would happen, but I knew it would happen eventually. And now that it's here, I'm going to take my time and enjoy watching them squirm. Am I wrong for not even hearing them out? Part of me knows they're family, and maybe I should at least listen. But the other part of me, the part that remembers sitting at that dinner table while they threw napkins at me and called me a loser, that part says they can sit in that hallway until they figure out I'm never opening that door. Update 1. Okay, so a lot has happened since my last post, and honestly, I'm still processing all of it. First off, thank you to everyone who commented. Reading through all your responses while my family was literally camped outside my apartment was therapeutic in a way I didn't expect. Some of you told me to stand my ground, some said I should at least hear them out, and a few suggested I was being too harsh. I appreciate all the perspectives even if I didn't agree with all of them. So here's what went down. They stayed in my hallway for 7 hours. 7 hours of sitting there, occasionally knocking, talking among themselves loud enough for me to hear through the door about how worried they were, how they just needed 5 minutes to explain. My building manager actually came by around hour 4 because other tenants were complaining, and I heard my dad tell him there was a family emergency and they were waiting for me to get home. The manager bought it and left them alone. Around 6 p.m., I was getting genuinely annoyed because I couldn't leave my apartment and I had groceries to pick up, and honestly, the whole situation was making me tense despite how much satisfaction I was getting from their desperation. I finally texted my dad. I told him I'd meet them at the parking lot behind a shopping center, about 2 miles from my place in 1 hour, and if anyone else showed up besides him and my mom, I'd leave immediately. He responded within seconds, saying, "Yes, thank you, we'll be there. We just need to talk, please." The speed of that reply told me everything I needed to know about how desperate they were. I got to the parking lot early and parked where I could see the entrance. They showed up exactly on time, just the two of them in my dad's car, and they looked rough. My mom's makeup was smudged like she'd been crying for hours, and my dad had this exhausted, defeated look that I'd never seen on him before. Part of me almost felt bad. Almost. They got in my car because I wasn't getting in theirs, and the first thing my mom did was reach for my hand. I pulled it away and told her we weren't doing that. She started crying immediately and said she was so sorry that they'd been terrible to me, that she'd been thinking about that birthday party for days and couldn't believe what they'd done. My dad jumped in and said they were going through a rough time back then and they took their stress out on me, and it wasn't fair, and they knew that now. I asked them what rough time they were going through 2.5 years ago that justified publicly humiliating. My dad got defensive and said the business was struggling even back then, that he was stressed about money, and he took it out on me because I was an easy target. My mom added that seeing me struggle reminded her of when they were young and poor, and it scared her, so she pushed me away instead of helping me. And here's where it got interesting. I asked my mom why seeing me struggle scared her but didn't inspire her to actually help me, why she never offered money or connections or even just emotional support. She got quiet and then admitted that my siblings, especially Anita, had convinced her that helping me would just enable me to keep failing, that I needed to hit rock bottom to get motivated. I sat with that for a second and then asked if Anita was the one who suggested they be harder on me. My mom hesitated, but my dad confirmed it. He said Anita had always been competitive with me even when we were kids, and when I was struggling, she saw an opportunity to make herself look better by comparison. She'd been telling them for months before the birthday party that they were too soft on me, that I was taking advantage of their kindness, that they needed to give me some tough love. My dad said he went along with it because, honestly, he was embarrassed that his youngest son couldn't get his life together, and Anita's suggestion gave him permission to express that embarrassment as anger instead of dealing with his own shame. He said the night of the birthday party he'd had a few drinks, and when everyone started joining in on the jokes, he felt like he was bonding with the family at my expense, and it felt good in the moment. I asked my mom why she threw away the card I made her. She started crying harder and said she didn't know, that everyone was laughing and she wanted to be part of the group, so she rejected my gift to fit in with what everyone else was doing. She said she went back for it later that night and kept it, that she's looked at it probably 100 times since then, feeling terrible about what happened. This is the part where I should probably tell you that I didn't buy any of this apology. Not because I don't think they feel bad now, but because they only feel bad because they need something from me. If my dad's business was fine and they'd just found out I was successful, would they be sitting in my car crying and apologizing? Or would they be asking me why I never told them and making it about how I shut them out? I know the answer to that question, but I let them keep talking because I wanted to understand the full situation before I made any decisions. My dad eventually got to the real reason they needed to talk to me. He said the business has been losing money for the past 18 months. A couple of big clients left, fuel costs went up, and he had to let go of some drivers, which meant he couldn't take on as much work. He's been barely making the loan payments, and he's maxed out on credit trying to keep things afloat. He said 2 months ago the bank contacted him about restructuring the loan because of the late payments over the year. They want him to either refinance with better terms or find a way to inject more capital into the business. The problem is that because I'm a co-signer and my name is on the collateral, he can't do anything without my involvement. He needs me to either co-sign on a new loan, release my interest in the business so he can restructure on his own, or agree to some kind of settlement where I get paid back, and he finds another way to secure the loan. I asked him what happens if I don't do any of those things. He said the bank could call the loan, which would mean he'd have to pay back the remaining balance immediately, or they'd seize the business assets and come after the collateral, which includes the money I put down plus whatever additional security I'm entitled to as a co-signer. He'd lose the business and probably have to declare bankruptcy. My mom jumped in and said it wasn't just about him, that if he lost the business, they'd lose their house too, because they'd taken out a home equity loan 2 years ago to cover business expenses. She said Anita and her husband had been helping them with money here and there, but it wasn't enough, and now Anita and her husband were having their own financial problems and couldn't help anymore. I asked what kind of financial problems Anita was having. My dad said her husband had gotten into some bad investments and lost a significant amount of money, and they were trying to rebuild their savings. He said Anita was still doing fine at her job, but they'd had to cut back on a lot of expenses and couldn't afford to keep helping my parents. Then my mom said something that made me realize how deep this went. She said Ellis and Dominic had also been contributing money to help my dad's business over the years, that all 3 of my siblings had invested in the company at different times expecting returns that never came. She said the whole family's finances were tangled up in this business, and if it failed, everyone would be affected. I asked how much money my siblings had put in total. My dad estimated around $80,000 between the 3 of them over the past 5 years. I asked if they knew the business was failing when they invested. He said they knew it was struggling, but they believed in him and wanted to help family. That's when I understood the real dynamic here. This wasn't just about my dad's business failing. This was about my siblings having invested money they couldn't afford to lose, my parents having mortgaged their house, and all of them realizing that I was the only person who could either save the situation or let it all collapse. And the person they needed to grovel to was the same person they'd spent years treating like he was worthless. I asked my parents if Anita knew they were meeting with me. My dad said yes, that she was the one who insisted they come to my apartment today because she was panicking about losing the money she'd invested. I asked if she was still telling them I was a loser who needed tough love. My mom said no, that Anita had been very upset when she found out how successful I'd become, that she'd been crying about how badly she'd treated me. I told my parents I needed to think about everything they'd told me and I'd be in touch. My dad immediately started begging. He said they didn't have time, that the bank needed an answer within 2 weeks or they'd start foreclosure proceedings. He said, please, we're family. We made mistakes, but we're trying to make it right. You can't let us lose everything over one bad night. I told him it wasn't one bad night. It was years of dismissiveness and cruelty and using me as the family punching bag so everyone else could feel superior. I said that birthday party was just the worst example, but it represented how they'd treated me my entire adult life. My mom said I was right, that they'd been terrible, but did their mistakes really deserve this level of punishment? And that's when I finally let myself say what I'd been thinking for 2.5 years. I told them this wasn't punishment. Punishment implies I'm doing something to them. I'm not doing anything. I'm simply not helping them. There's a difference. They got themselves into this situation by making bad financial decisions and treating me so badly that I have no interest in maintaining a relationship with them. The consequences they're facing are the natural result of their own choices. My dad said I was being cruel. I told him to remember that the next time he wanted to call someone a loser at a birthday party. I got out of the car. They both got out too and followed me to my car. My mom was full-on sobbing at this point, saying, please don't do this. We're begging you. We're your parents. My dad was saying, we'll do anything. What do you want from us? Just tell us, and we'll do it. I told them I wanted them to leave me alone, and I'd contact them when I decided what I was going to do. I drove off, and they didn't follow me, probably because they knew pushing me further would only make things worse. But here's where things got complicated. When I got home, I had 17 missed calls, 6 from Anita, 4 from Dominic, 3 from Ellis, 2 from Aunt Cynthia, and 2 from Uncle Larry. They'd apparently all been conferencing together while I was meeting with my parents, trying to figure out how to approach me. Anita had left a voicemail. She was crying in it and said she knew I had every right to hate her, but she was begging me to help them. That she had 2 kids and if she lost the money she'd invested in the business, she wouldn't be able to afford their private school tuition, and they'd have to move to a smaller house. She said she was sorry for everything, that she'd been jealous of me our whole lives because I was the youngest and got more attention, and she'd taken it too far. That last part made me laugh because the idea that I got more attention as the youngest is insane. I got more negative attention maybe, but certainly not more love or support. Dominic's voicemail was different. He wasn't apologetic at all. He said I needed to stop being petty and do the right thing for the family, that holding a grudge over some jokes at a birthday party was childish and I was destroying people's lives over my ego. He said if I didn't help Dad, I'd regret it, because I'd have to live with knowing I could have saved the family and chose not to. I listened to all the voicemails and deleted them. Then I texted my dad and told him I wanted a meeting with all my siblings present. No parents, no extended family, just the 4 of us. He responded asking when, and I said I'd let him know. Because here's the thing. I've spent 2.5 years preparing for this exact scenario. I've talked to lawyers. I've reviewed every document. I understand exactly what leverage I have and what options are available. And what my family doesn't know yet is that my position is even stronger than they realize. See, when I put that $15,000 down as collateral, the loan agreement included a clause that gives me certain rights if the loan goes into default, including the right to assume control of the business assets, which means if the bank calls the loan and my dad can't pay, I could potentially take over the business or force a sale and collect what I'm owed first before other creditors get anything. My siblings invested money as essentially silent partners with no formal agreements or protections. If the business fails, they're at the bottom of the creditor list, but I'm at the top, which means I could let this whole thing collapse, collect my money plus interest and penalties, and walk away while they all lose everything they invested. Or I could help them. I could agree to restructure the loan, maybe even invest more money to stabilize the business, save my parents' house, protect my siblings' investments. I could be the hero who swoops in and saves the family, but why would I do that for people who spent years making me feel worthless? Why would I save people who threw napkins at me and laughed while I smiled through the humiliation? I'm meeting with my siblings on Saturday at a diner. Anita suggested. I'm going to lay out exactly what the situation is and exactly what I'm willing to offer. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they react when they realize the person they treated like garbage is the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. Some of you might think I'm being too harsh. That family is family, and I should help them despite everything. But I keep coming back to that birthday party. I keep thinking about how I sat there planning to share my good news, and instead got pelted with napkins while everyone laughed. And I think about all the years before that of being dismissed and mocked and compared unfavorably to my siblings who are now begging for my help. So yeah, I'm going to take my time with this, and I'm going to make sure that whatever decision I make, it's on my terms and for my reasons. Not because they're sorry now that they need something from me. Update 2. Saturday came and I showed up at the diner 20 minutes early because I wanted to watch them arrive and see how they interacted with each other before I sat down. I parked across the street with a clear view of the entrance and waited. Anita got there first, alone, and she sat in her car for a few minutes checking her phone before going inside. Then Ellis showed up with Dominic, and I could see them talking in Ellis's car for a while before they went in together. That told me they'd coordinated beforehand, probably strategizing about how to handle me. I gave them another 10 minutes to sweat it out before I walked in. They'd gotten a booth in the back corner, probably for privacy, and all 3 of them looked up when I approached. Anita's eyes were red like she'd been crying recently. Ellis looked uncomfortable. Dominic looked angry, which honestly didn't surprise me at all. I slid into the booth across from them, and nobody said anything for a long moment. The waitress came over and I ordered coffee, and Anita asked for water, and then there was more silence. Finally, Anita spoke up and said, "Thank you for meeting with us. We know this is hard for everyone." I told her to skip the pleasantries and get to the point. Dominic jumped in immediately and said the point was that I needed to stop playing games and help Dad refinance the loan so we could all move on with our lives. I asked him why he thought he could tell me what I needed to do. He said because we're family and that's what family does. They help each other even when things are difficult. I asked him if that's what family does, then where was that energy 2.5 years ago when I was struggling and you all decided public humiliation was the better option? Dominic said, "We've been over this. It was one night, and we all admitted it was wrong and apologized. How long was I going to hold on to this grudge?" Ellis cut in and said it wasn't just one night, though, that he'd been thinking about it, and he realized we'd all been pretty dismissive of me for years before that party. He said he wasn't trying to make excuses, but he wanted me to understand that the family dynamic had gotten toxic and we'd all participated in it without realizing how bad it had gotten. He said seeing me fail made them all feel better about their own problems, and that was wrong. Anita started crying again and said she'd been especially terrible because she'd always felt like mom and dad favored me when we were kids and she resented it. She said when I started struggling as an adult, it felt like justice to her. Like finally, I was getting what she thought I deserved for being the favorite. But then she said she realized later that I was never actually the favorite. That was just her perception. And by the time she understood that, the damage was already done. I let them talk because I wanted to hear all of this. I wanted to hear them try to explain away years of cruelty. When they were done, I asked Anita how her kids were doing. She looked confused by the question and said they were fine. I said, that's good, because I heard from Dad that if you lose the money you invested in his business, you won't be able to afford their private school anymore. Her face went white and she asked how much Dad had told me. I said he told me everything, that all three of them had invested around $80,000 total, that her husband had lost money in bad investments, that they'd been helping Mom and Dad financially and couldn't anymore. I said I knew the whole family's finances were tied up in this business, and if it failed, everyone would be affected. Dominic said, fine, you know the situation, so you understand why we need you to help us. I asked him how much he'd invested. He said about $25,000 over the past 3 years. I asked Ellis, and he said around $30,000. So Anita had put in the remaining $25,000 or so. I asked them if they had any paperwork for these investments, any contracts, any agreements about returns or repayment terms. Ellis said no, it was all just family helping family. We trusted Dad to do the right thing. I told him that was a mistake, a big one, because without any formal agreements, they were essentially unsecured creditors, which meant if the business went under, they'd be at the bottom of the list to get paid back. Anita said, what do you mean at the bottom of the list? I explained that when a business fails, there's an order to who gets paid. Secured creditors like the bank come first. Then there are certain legal priorities, and at the very bottom are unsecured creditors like them who gave money based on handshake agreements. Dominic said, okay, so we're at the bottom, so what? I said, so I'm not. I'm a co-signer on the original loan with collateral attached, which means I'm way up the priority list. If this business fails and assets get liquidated, I get paid before any of you see a cent. The table went quiet. Ellis asked how much I'd get. I said based on my calculations with my lawyer, probably around $40,000 after interest and penalties, which would leave essentially nothing for the three of them to split. Anita said, wait, you've been talking to a lawyer about this? I said, of course I have. I've been preparing for this exact situation for 2.5 years. Did they think I was just sitting around hoping everything would work out? I knew eventually Dad's business would hit problems, and I knew eventually they'd come to me for help. And I made sure I understood exactly what my legal position was before that happened. Dominic called me a piece of work and said I'd been planning to screw over the family this whole time. I told him I hadn't been planning anything. I'd been preparing. There's a difference. Planning implies I was going to take action to make something happen. Preparing means I was getting ready in case something happened. And it did happen, because Dad made bad business decisions and you all threw money at a failing company without doing due diligence. Ellis said, okay, we get it. You're in a better position than us legally, but you're still our brother, and we're asking you to help us. What do you want from us to make this right? And this is where I'd been waiting to get to. I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me and put it on the table. Inside were 3 documents I'd had my lawyer draw up. I told them these were agreements that would formalize their investments, give them some actual legal standing as investors rather than just people who gave money away. Anita grabbed the papers and started reading. Her face went through several expressions as she read, and then she looked at me and said these terms are ridiculous. I asked her which part she found ridiculous. She said all of it, that I was asking them to accept a 10% equity stake in the business collectively, while I would get 40%, and that I would have final say on all major business decisions. I told her that was the price for me agreeing to help restructure the loan and invest additional capital to stabilize the business. I'd put in another $50,000 on top of what I'd already contributed, which would give Dad the cushion he needed to get through the next rough year. In exchange, I'd get operational control and a significant ownership stake. They'd get their money back eventually once the business became profitable again, but it might take 5 years or more. Dominic said this was extortion. I reminded him that extortion was illegal, and I wasn't doing anything illegal. I was offering them a deal. They could accept these terms and have a chance at getting their money back eventually, or they could refuse and watch the business fail and lose everything. Ellis asked what would happen to Dad under these terms. I said Dad would retain 25% ownership and would still run day-to-day operations, but he'd have to run major decisions by me. I'd essentially be a silent partner with veto power. Ellis said Dad would never agree to that he'd rather lose the business than give up that much control. I told them that was between Dad and them. But the bank needed an answer by the end of next week, and this was the only offer they were getting from me. Anita said there had to be another way, that they could find another investor or get a different loan somewhere else. I asked her if she'd spent the past few days looking into that. She went quiet. Because here's what I knew that they were just figuring out. Dad's credit was shot. The business was failing. No bank was going to refinance without serious collateral or a co-signer with good credit. And I was the only person in the family with both good credit and the legal standing to actually do anything about the situation. Dominic said he'd rather lose his money than agree to let me take over the family business. I told him that was fine with me. He could lose his money, but he should know that if the business failed and Dad declared bankruptcy, it would affect their parents' ability to retire, would probably cost them their house, and would damage relationships across the entire extended family. Anita said, why would it affect extended family? I said because Mom and Dad had borrowed money from Uncle Larry and Aunt Cynthia too over the years, hadn't they? Small amounts here and there that they'd promised to pay back once the business turned around. And those debts would come due in bankruptcy proceedings. Ellis asked how I knew about money borrowed from extended family. I said I'd done my research, that I'd had a long conversation with Uncle Larry earlier in the week, where he'd admitted that he'd loaned Mom and Dad about $15,000 over the past 2 years. He'd been upset about them asking me for help because he felt like he'd already done his part and gotten nothing back. The three of them exchanged looks, and I could see they hadn't known about the extended family money either. This was getting messier for them by the minute. Anita said she couldn't believe Mom and Dad had been borrowing from everyone and not telling anyone how bad things really were. I said that's what happens when people are desperate and ashamed. They hide the full extent of the problem and hope something will save them. But nothing had saved them except blind luck and family members willing to throw money at the problem without asking hard questions. Dominic asked what I really wanted from all this. He said clearly I had some kind of endgame beyond just taking control of a failing business. I told him I wanted exactly what I was getting. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be powerless and dependent on someone who didn't particularly care about their well-being. I wanted them to sit across from me and beg for help, knowing that I could say no, and there was nothing they could do about it. Anita said this was cruel. I asked her if it was crueler than throwing napkins at someone at a birthday party while everyone laughed. She didn't answer. Ellis said he'd talked to Dad about the terms, but he couldn't promise anything. I told him he had until Thursday to get back to me. That gave them 5 days to either accept my offer or find another solution. After Thursday, I was withdrawing the offer and letting the bank handle it however they wanted. Dominic said 5 days wasn't enough time. I said it was the time they had. Anita asked what would happen if Dad accepted the terms, but they didn't want to take the equity stake I was offering. I said then they'd lose their entire investment because Dad would need to accept my capital injection to restructure the loan, which would dilute their informal investments down to essentially nothing. Ellis said we're trapped then. Either we accept your terms or we lose everything. I told him now he was understanding the situation correctly. He said I'd planned this out pretty carefully for someone who claimed they weren't actively trying to destroy the family. I said I'd planned this out carefully because I knew my family would eventually need something from me, and I wanted to be ready when they did. That's when things got heated. Dominic stood up and said he wasn't going to sit here and listen to me act like I was some kind of victim when I was clearly enjoying watching them squirm. He said the way I was handling this proved they'd been right about me all along, that I was petty and vindictive and couldn't handle life not going my way. I stayed sitting and told him he could think whatever he wanted, but it didn't change the facts. The facts were that they needed my help. I was offering very specific terms, and they could take it or leave it. Dominic said I was going to regret this, that family was forever, and I was burning bridges I'd never be able to rebuild. I told him the bridges were already burned. They'd burned them 2.5 years ago and had just been too self-absorbed to notice. Everything since then had just been me accepting reality and acting accordingly. Anita started crying harder and said, "We used to be close when we were kids. Didn't I remember that? Didn't that mean anything to me?" I remembered us being close when we were kids. I also remembered her turning on me the second it became socially advantageous to do so. I told her childhood nostalgia wasn't going to change my decision. Ellis said he understood I was angry, but this was affecting more than just the people who'd hurt me, that their kids were going to suffer, that Mom and Dad were elderly and might not recover from losing everything. And that's the part that almost got to me. Almost. Because it was designed to make me feel guilty for consequences that weren't actually my responsibility. Their kids weren't suffering because of me. They were suffering because their parents made bad financial decisions. Mom and Dad weren't losing everything because of me. They were losing everything because they'd built their lives on a foundation of debt and bad business management. But I didn't say any of that because I didn't need to justify myself to them. Instead, I told Ellis that I'd take his concerns into consideration. He seemed to take that as a hopeful sign and said thank you, that he appreciated me at least thinking about it. Dominic scoffed and said Ellis was wasting his breath trying to appeal to my better nature since I clearly didn't have one. I stood up and put money on the table for my coffee. I told them they had until Thursday to decide and to make sure Dad understood the terms clearly before making any decisions. Anita asked if we could talk again before Thursday, just her and me, because she wanted to explain more about why she'd acted the way she did. I said no. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and now it was just a matter of making a choice. I left the diner and sat in my car for a few minutes watching them through the window. They were arguing with each other. Dominic was gesturing aggressively. Ellis had his head in his hands, and Anita was on her phone probably calling my parents. The weight of what was happening was finally hitting them, and it was satisfying in a way I'd been imagining for years. But here's what happened that I wasn't expecting. When I got home, there was someone waiting in the lobby of my building. Uncle Larry? He was sitting in one of the chairs by the mailboxes, and he stood up when he saw me come in. He said he needed to talk to me about what was happening with my dad's business and about the money he'd loaned them over the years. I told him I didn't have anything to discuss with him. He said that was fine. He'd just talk and I could listen. He said he'd always liked me, that he thought the family had treated me badly, and he'd told my parents as much after that birthday party. But he'd also loaned them money in good faith, and if they went bankrupt, he'd never see it again. And he needed that money because he was planning to retire in 2 years, and that $15,000 was part of his retirement fund. He said he wasn't asking me to forgive my family or even to help them beyond what I was comfortable with. He just wanted me to know that there were other people affected by this situation who hadn't been part of the cruelty I'd experienced. He said Aunt Cynthia had been against the whole thing at the birthday party, that she'd told everyone to stop and they'd ignored her. And now she was losing sleep worrying about the money they'd loaned. I asked him why he was telling me this. He said because he thought I deserved to know the full picture before I made my final decision. Then he left without asking me for anything specific or trying to guilt me further. And honestly, that conversation messed with my head more than the meeting with my siblings had. Because up until that point, I'd been able to keep things simple in my mind. My family had treated me terribly. They were facing consequences. I had no obligation to help them. But Uncle Larry had always been decent to me. Not perfect. He'd laughed at some of the jokes at the party, but he'd also apologized afterward and had tried to stay in touch over the years even when I'd been distant. And Aunt Cynthia had tried to shut down the cruelty that night. I remembered that now. So now, I'm sitting here with 3 days left until Thursday, and I'm starting to realize this situation is more complicated than I'd wanted it to be. My siblings are calling and texting constantly. My parents have left more voicemails, and I have to decide if I'm going to stick with my harsh terms or if I'm going to adjust them to account for people like my aunt and uncle who are collateral damage in all this. Part of me says, stick to the plan. They all chose to involve themselves in Dad's business without asking questions. They're adults who made their own financial decisions. But another part of me is wondering if I'm letting my anger at my siblings and parents hurt people who don't deserve it. I don't know. I genuinely don't know what I'm going to do. Final update. Thursday came, and I still hadn't heard from my dad or siblings about whether they were accepting my terms. I'd spent the past 3 days ignoring calls and messages from everyone except my lawyer, who I'd been in contact with to make sure all the paperwork was ready regardless of what decision they made. Tuesday night, my mom had shown up at my apartment again, but I'd watched her through the security camera for 20 minutes until she finally left. Wednesday morning, Anita sent me a long text about how her kids were asking why Uncle Nathan never came to visit anymore, and it was breaking her heart to lie to them. I didn't respond to any of it. I'd given them a deadline and terms, and that was all they were getting from me. Thursday morning at 8, my dad called. I answered. He asked if we could meet one more time before the deadline, just him and me, because he wanted to discuss the terms face-to-face. I told him we could meet at the same parking lot at noon and he had 1 hour. He agreed immediately. I got there early again and watched him arrive. He was alone, and he looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past week. He got in my car and sat there for a minute before saying anything. Then he told me he'd reviewed my terms with a lawyer of his own, and the lawyer had confirmed that I was being more than generous given my legal position. He said the lawyer had actually been surprised I was offering to invest more money at all, instead of just letting the business collapse and collecting what I was owed. I told him my lawyer had said the same thing. My dad asked me why I was offering to help at all if I hated them so much. I said I didn't hate them. Hate required caring about someone enough to feel that strongly. I was indifferent to them, but I saw an opportunity to turn a failing business into something profitable while also making it very clear what the new family dynamic was going to be. He asked what I meant by new family dynamic. I told him that for my entire adult life they'd treated me like I was beneath them. Like I was the family embarrassment who needed to be managed and mocked and kept in his place. And now the dynamic was reversed. Now I was the one with power and resources, and they were the ones who needed me. And I wanted that power dynamic formalized in a way they couldn't ignore or pretend wasn't happening. My dad said that was cruel. I reminded him about the napkins at the birthday party and asked him to define cruel for me again. He went quiet. Then he said he'd spent a lot of time thinking about that night, and he realized he'd been taking out his own failures on me. He said when I was struggling, it reminded him of his own struggles when he was younger. And instead of having compassion, he'd gotten angry because I was forcing him to confront parts of himself he didn't like. I asked him if that explanation was supposed to make me feel better. He said no. He was just trying to help me understand why it happened. I told him I already understood why it happened. People who are insecure about their own worth tear down others to feel better about themselves. It wasn't complicated psychology. What I wanted to know was whether he was accepting my terms or not. He said he was accepting them. He said he didn't have a choice. I told him he absolutely had a choice. He could refuse my help and let the bank foreclose. That was a valid choice. He said that wasn't really a choice though, was it? Not when it would destroy his life and hurt everyone else. I said sure it was a choice. It just wasn't a choice he liked. But that didn't make it not a choice. Then he asked about my siblings. I told him they'd have to decide individually whether to accept the equity stake I was offering or walk away from their investments entirely. He said Anita couldn't afford to lose that money. I said then Anita should accept the terms. He said Dominic was furious about the whole situation and was refusing to sign anything. I said that was Dominic's decision to make. My dad asked if there was any way to adjust the terms to make them less harsh. I asked him what he thought would be fair. He said maybe I could take 30% instead of 40% and give them more control over business decisions. I told him no. These were the terms. He could take them or leave them, but I wasn't negotiating. He sat there looking defeated, and then he said he'd sign the papers. I pulled the documents out of my bag and handed them to him. He read through them slowly, and I watched him realize exactly what he was agreeing to. He was giving me control of the business he'd spent 15 years building. He was admitting that his youngest son, the one he'd called a loser in front of the whole family, was now his boss. He signed them. His hand was shaking, but he signed every page. I took the documents back and told him I'd have my lawyer file everything with the bank by end of day. He asked what happened next. I said next he focused on running the business day to day, and I'd review the financials monthly and approve any major decisions. We'd restructure the debt, cut unnecessary expenses, and slowly turn things around over the next few years. He asked if this meant we were going to have a relationship now. I told him we'd have a business relationship. That was it. He said, what about family dinners and holidays and normal family stuff? I said there wouldn't be any of that. He'd burned that bridge 2.5 years ago, and I had no interest in rebuilding it. He could tell people whatever he wanted about why I wasn't at family events, but the truth was I simply didn't want to be around any of them. My dad started crying, actually crying in my passenger seat. He said he'd ruined everything and he didn't know how to fix it. I told him he couldn't fix it. That's what he didn't seem to understand. Some things you break and they stay broken. He said he was sorry, that he'd been sorry for years but hadn't known how to reach out to me. I said he'd had years to reach out. He'd chosen not to until he needed something from me. He said that wasn't fair, that I'd been avoiding them too. I said I'd been avoiding them because they'd made it clear they didn't respect me or value me as a person. Why would I voluntarily spend time with people who thought I was a loser? He didn't have an answer to that. I told him to get out of my car. He asked if we could talk more, if there was anything he could say or do to make this better. I said no. The conversation was over. We had a business arrangement now, and that was the extent of our relationship. He got out and stood in the parking lot watching me drive away. That afternoon, I got separate calls from my siblings. Ellis called first and said he was going to sign the agreement, that he understood why I was doing this and he didn't blame me even though it hurt. He said he hoped someday down the line we could have some kind of relationship again, but he understood if that never happened. I told him I appreciated him being straightforward about it. Anita called an hour later. She was crying before she even said hello. She said she was signing the papers because she didn't have a choice, but she wanted me to know that she'd never forgive herself for how she'd treated me. She said she'd been thinking about it constantly, and she realized she'd projected all her insecurities onto me and made my life miserable because of her own issues. I told her that was probably accurate. She asked if there was any chance I'd ever forgive her. I said I didn't think so. She said she understood and hung up. Dominic didn't call. He sent a text message that said he wasn't signing anything and I could keep my blood money and he never wanted to hear from me again. I replied okay and blocked his number. My mom called that evening and left a voicemail saying she'd heard Dad had signed the papers and she was grateful I was helping them, even if things between us were broken. She said she'd always loved me and she hoped I'd find happiness. I deleted the voicemail without listening to all of it. Uncle Larry called Friday morning. He said he'd heard about the deal I'd made with my dad and he wanted to know if there was any way for him to get his money back as part of the restructuring. I told him I'd include repayment of his loan as part of the business expenses over the next 2 years. He said thank you, and he was sorry about everything that had happened. I told him he didn't need to apologize. He wasn't the one who'd treated me badly. He said he'd still participated by not standing up for me more, and he regretted that. The bank accepted the restructuring proposal, and the new loan terms went into effect the following week. I transferred the $50,000 I'd promised and started reviewing the business financials to figure out what needed to change. My dad sent me weekly reports, and we had brief phone calls about operations, but we kept everything professional and distant. My siblings stopped trying to contact me after the first month. Anita sent one more text in December saying she hoped I'd consider coming to Christmas dinner, but I didn't respond. My mom still calls my number once a month, but I never answer and she stopped leaving voicemails. The business is slowly improving. We cut expenses, renegotiated some contracts, and found more efficient ways to operate. My dad is actually decent at the day-to-day management when he's not making terrible financial decisions. At the rate we're going, the company should be profitable again within 18 months. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to. A lot of people in the comments on my previous posts said I should just walk away, that staying involved with the business meant staying tied to my family. But walking away wouldn't have given me what I wanted. Walking away would have been letting them off easy. They'd have lost money and the business and their house. But they'd have been able to blame me for it. They'd have been able to tell themselves and everyone else that I was the vindictive son who abandoned his family in their time of need. This way, they can't do that. This way, they have to live with the fact that I saved them, but only on my terms. Every month when my dad sends me those financial reports, he has to confront the fact that his loser son is now his boss. Every time Anita looks at her equity statement, she has to remember why she's only getting 10%. Every time my mom thinks about family gatherings and realizes I'm not there, she has to remember that birthday party. They don't get to be the victims in this story. They don't get to say I turned my back on family. They have to live with the knowledge that I was willing to help them but not willing to forgive them. And that distinction matters. Some people might think this is too harsh, that I should have been the bigger person and just forgiven them and moved on. But being the bigger person is overrated. When the other people haven't actually changed, they've just become desperate enough to pretend they have. My family didn't suddenly realize they'd been terrible to me out of moral growth. They realized it when they needed money, so yeah. I saved my family's business. I gave my siblings a chance to get their money back eventually. I'm even paying back my uncle's loan. But I'm doing it all from a distance, with clear boundaries, and with the understanding that we will never have the kind of relationship they're hoping for. They're going to have to live with that. And honestly, after spending 2.5 years planning for this exact outcome, watching it all unfold exactly as I'd hoped has been more satisfying than any apology could have been. The napkins they threw at me that night landed and then fell away. But the memory of sitting there smiling while they humiliated me, that's permanent. And now they get to live with a permanent reminder too. Every single month when those reports come in,